Hello, everyone, and welcome to this fantastically fun members live stream. I am Glenn. We are the Northeast Georgia History Center, and I did say Georgia, didn't I? So today we're going to be talking about the founding of Georgia, and we are only going to scratch the surface. This is a fascinating topic, especially for us native Georgians, and honestly, somewhere there must be some semester-long graduate-level program that's just about this. So we're going to squish this into just a few minutes. And please know that there's so much more to it, but it's a really fascinating subject. If nothing else, we hope this makes you go check out some books, check out some websites, and learn a little more. So how did Georgia begin? Well, that, of course, is the great question, isn't it? In effect, there were a group of men called, at first they were just friends together, trying to find a way to first create a new colony for His Majesty overseas in the New World, and his colonies in North America, and they wanted to make it a colony unlike those that had been. Of course, Georgia is the 13th and last colony, and the colonies had developed up and down the Atlantic seaboard in very different ways. Some were land grants, some were proprietary, given to certain members of the aristocracy to run. Some were outright royal colonies that were had governors appointed from the very beginning. But these men wanted to create something different. In effect, they wanted to create a utopia in the New World. And I want you to take a look at this picture. This is a painting of the trustees. I've squished some people out, but I'm going to come back to that in a second because they become very important. So the trustees began to work on a plan to bring worthy, needy people to a new start in the New World. And they quickly recruited someone into their ranks who would prove to be one of the, if not the, most influential and important person in the founding of Georgia, James Oglethorpe. Now, James Oglethorpe was born in 1696 to a fairly wealthy and upper-class family. He was the minor aristocracy. He went to school. He dropped out of school to serve in the Anglo-Turkish War. He comes back and eventually is elected to Parliament. And in Parliament, he's one of those people that sits on the back bench and doesn't do a lot, but he, at some point, becomes very interested in prison reform. You see, in this time period, people who went into debt heavily could be thrown into prison for being in debt. And one of Oglethorpe's friends found themselves in this situation. He was put into jail and he died in debtor's prison. This made Oglethorpe want to do something about it, so he began agitating for prison reform and debt relief reform. This brought him to the attention of the trustees, and they're like, here's a like-minded soul who can come along, help us out, and will be an important member of the trustees. So they recruit Oglethorpe. They have a request to the Crown, and the Crown and Parliament grants the trustees a charter for a new colony. And they establish the colony basically on paper first, and they begin promoting the colony. This next slide has this great reasons for establishing the colony of Georgia with regard to the trade of Great Britain. This is one of those great 18th century titles that goes on for the entire page. But suffice to say that the trustees initially began to be interested in helping folks who were in debt to get a new start. As time goes by, and as they begin interviewing potential settlers to go to the new colony, that sort of goes by the wayside because the colony becomes more complex. It is still based on very, very high ideals, but the colony is set up to be a trade boon to the realm of Great Britain. It is set up to be a buffer colony because you have to understand the Spanish are down in Florida, and the Spanish technically claim land all the way up to Savannah. So the fact that the British are establishing the colony of Georgia means that they're sort of treading on Spanish claims. So this colony is going to have to be militarily strong. It's going to have to sustain itself through trade, and they think they'll be able to do this by transmitting mulberry trees, which have silkworms, and that a new silk trade will grow up in Georgia. They're going to plant vines and create vineyards to have wine. They're going to have all these expensive items, and of course to help people. And so this is what it is originally established for. And as a result, because of these things, to help the imperial trade, to help the military establishment of the British in the New World, they're going to be getting subsidies from Parliament as well as gathering together charitable organizations. And so they began looking for a good place along the coast to put this. Oglethorpe encourages them as a military man to put the first part of the settlement as far away from the Spanish center of power as possible. The Spanish center of power is St. Augustine, way down here. So, and Charleston is, right up there. And so they send some scouts ahead, and they're like, okay, it needs probably to be somewhere on the Savannah River. That's as far as they get. And what's interesting is the trustees recruit these people, and then they say, here's what it's going to be. And this is remarkable, folks. A different kind of colony. There will be no alcohol. There will be no slavery at all in the new colony of Georgia. There will be limits on how much land a single person can own, and the transfer and buying of land will be heavily regulated in the colony to prevent there from being large plantation owners the way there were in North and South Carolina and in the rest of His Majesty's colonies. So this is really supposed to be a yeoman farmer's paradise. That's what Georgia is set up to be. And the trustees have control. The charter states that the trustees can set these rules and set the guidelines for 20 years. And so Oglethorpe becomes very excited about this. And as a matter of fact, he is the only trustee who agrees to go over with the first ship. Spoiler alert, he's the only trustee that ever actually goes to Georgia. And so the ship, the Anne, sets sail from Gravesend in November of 1732 with 115 settlers aboard. One of those is James Oglethorpe. It takes them 2 months to cross the Atlantic. Now think about this, crammed on a little ship with the supplies that you need to live on the ship and theoretically to survive in the new territory for 2 months at sea. Finally, in January, they land in Charleston, South Carolina, and they sort of get off the ship and they kind of get their bearings and they start to gather up supplies. Oglethorpe goes ahead, goes up to the Savannah River in a smaller boat, finds what he thinks is the perfect place, a place called the Yamacraw Bluffs, named so because a tribe named the Yamacraw Indians lives there, goes back, gets everyone, and they sail up the Savannah River. And the ship makes landfall at what is now Savannah, at the Yamacraw Bluff, and they climb up that bluff, and that is the first night of Georgia as a real colony. February 12th, 1733, still celebrated today as Georgia Day. And so they pitch their tents up there on the Yamacraw Bluff that first night, and so the colony of Georgia is officially established. Well, it's one thing to make up some rules on paper and plant a flag, but something totally different to make it a success. And this colony would not have been a success without the help of the Native Americans who lived there, and especially a guy named Tomochichi. Tomochichi was relatively old when Oglethorpe first met him, but as I said, he was sort of the chieftain, the tribal leader of the Indians in this area. And he was very welcoming to Oglethorpe. Oglethorpe was smart enough to know that this colony was only going to survive if it had not only the goodwill of the local Native Americans, but their help. And so he went to great lengths the entire time he was in the colony of Georgia to maintain those good relations. And Tomochichi was his chiefest friend and ally in that. You see this image here of Tomochichi and his younger son. And so the Native Americans not only begin to provide put things here, don't put things here. Here is some food. Here are the Native American groups you want to meet first and be on very good relations with. And they become, in effect, co-military allies, economic trading partners, and basically co-partners in establishing the colony of Georgia. A lot of folks forget this, but Tomochichi and his tribe is very, very important. So another thing Oglethorpe wants to do, and he had discussed this with the trustees, but it wasn't necessarily in their plans, but this is one of the big reasons he wanted to come to Georgia. When he establishes this first city, the city of Savannah, he wants it laid out with mathematical and scientific precision. And that's exactly what he does. So many towns and cities in the New World had been formed basically by, well, I'm going to put my house here and we'll put my house here, and then there'll be a street that runs between it, and the streets start to wind, and it's rather pell-mell how the town develops. Oglethorpe didn't want that for this new utopian colony of Georgia. He wanted it to be very organized, very orderly, and basically designed not only for defense, but for the most effective use of land. And the deal was each settler who came was going to get a town lot of a certain size where their house in town would be, with a garden out back. They would also get 50 acres per member of the household outside the town. That would be their farm, basically. So they would have a town lot and they would have an outside farm lot. And these people were grouped together for organization, for minor court issues, for militia units called tithings. You can see here, there's basically 10 houses in each little corner. This was the subunit of Savannah. You've got these tithings in each little section, and then in the square, in the middle of the square, there is a square, a common empty area, and then the trustee lots are going to be here on either side of the square, a couple of trustee lots. This is where they could establish what they needed. If they needed trustee gardens, if they needed a storehouse for trustee goods or something like that, that's would be controlled by the trustees. But you see how the streets, the lanes, the squares are all placed out. And these are set side by side. They're basically the building blocks of Savannah. That's how Oglethorpe laid it out. And as we'll see closer to the end of the presentation, this layout survives remarkably intact to this very day. And it has made Savannah one of the most beautiful areas in the entire world. Now, as the colony begins to develop, these settlers can't immediately be self-sustaining. So part of the deal is the trustees will provide everything for the settlers their first year. Their clothing, their food, their tools, their soap, everything, so that they can get this colony established. A lot of the people that they brought over with them were not just poor, untrained, unskilled laborers. They had to bring people who knew what they were doing, who could build a town. Blacksmiths, carpenters, bakers, folks like that are going to be able to keep the town going, and very experienced agriculturalists who could begin getting these crops in. Not just crops to eat, but those cash crops like mulberry trees for silk and vineyards. Now, another one of the groups that comes to Georgia just a little bit after this are the Salzburgers. Georgia becomes incredibly welcoming of people from all different backgrounds, not only religious backgrounds. There are Jewish groups that come to Georgia, but international groups. There are Scots, there are Swedes, there are Danes, and of course English that come to Georgia. But one of the most interesting groups are the Salzburgers. They were German in origin, and they were Protestants. And of course, in Europe at this time, there are the Catholic versus Protestant things going on. And there was a significant group of Salzburgers from the Salzburg area who were Protestant. And basically, the Archduke of that area decided to kick them out because they were Protestant. And so they had no recourse but to go somewhere else. So they appealed to another Protestant, His Majesty King George. And King George said, yes, not only will I give you aid, but I will send you to the new colony and you can take up station there. Georgia looks to be a pretty cool place. So these are not English speakers at first. There's a fellow named Boltzius who is their leader, and he takes this group to Georgia. And Oglethorpe has received word that they'll be coming. He is very welcoming to them. He basically meets them at the pier, shows them where their new town will be. They established the new town of Ebenezer. Now, Ebenezer, again, this is a relatively new colony. The Salzburgers move into Ebenezer, which is sort of south of Savannah, and it doesn't go very well. Turns out the soil is not great. There's a lot of malaria. A lot of the Salzburgers die of disease, unfortunately, and they go to Oglethorpe and they're like, look, we appreciate what you're doing, but the section you gave us to build our town is pretty terrible. Can we get some new land? And Oglethorpe, after some trying to figure out how to work this, he's like, yes, we will move you and give you a new place. So what we have here is a map. They put them on boats. They moved them upriver. up north of or north from the river of where Savannah proper is, and they began to establish a place called New Ebenezer. And this is a map of New Ebenezer. Does this layout look familiar to you? It should. It was only last couple of slides. So they begin to lay out Ebenezer along these very scientific, very Enlightenment methods. And so this is one of the great neat things about Georgia is it is begun with such high ideals. I'm very proud to be a Georgian because of this idea, right? We are incredibly welcoming of everyone who wants to come to the New World for a new start. We're trying to do away with all the immoral things, and we're trying to make a very egalitarian society. That starts to cause problems. We'll come back in a minute. Now, Oglethorpe wants to show his appreciation to all these natives who are giving up land and working with the Georgians for these new towns, outside towns to be established. So what he does is he decides to go back to England. He takes Tomochichi with him and Tomochichi's son and a delegation. And this is that picture I wanted to show you in its totality. So here we have the trustees on one side, and we have the group of Native Americans who have come with Oglethorpe to not only meet the trustees. Tomochichi goes and meets the king. And it's first a way for James Oglethorpe to sort of show his appreciation to have one king meet with another, as it were. But this is also, like I said, a great public relations effort so that he can show the natives here are even better than they are everywhere else. They can help us. Georgia's great. You need to not only give money to the cause, but perhaps if you're interested, you need to come and settle in Georgia, because there were waves of settlement. After that first 115, there were ships coming over with lots and lots more. As I said, they were coming from all over. And one of the places that Oglethorpe and the trustees decided to recruit from was from Scotland, because Scotland has some great fighting men. And as I said, Georgia was going to be a military buffer. What I say is, when I say a military buffer, South and North Carolina had already been established. They were relatively economically prosperous colonies, partially because they employed slavery in larger plantations. Again, we'll come back to that. But the Spanish have to have some sort of speed bump in effect before they get to those valuable colonies, which is a reason Georgia was established, which is a reason it gets parliamentary subsidies. And so we want to people Georgia with people who are not just necessarily carpenters and brick masons and bakers. We want people who can fight. So we start pulling in these groups and these Scots. And Georgia as a buffer zone means it's going to be more militarily based than some of the other colonies. And here we've got an image from the Company of Military Historians that sort of shows the different types of soldiers. You, of course, have the Native American ally. The Georgia did use a lot of Native American allies, especially the Yamacraw. Over here in the brown coat, you see that we have just a standard militiaman. The trustees also provided all the grown men with muskets and weapons so that they could serve in the militia. And you have some of these Scots, both on foot and mounted Scots, who could hold positions and sort of range through the country on patrol. That's where the term ranger comes from. And when James Oglethorpe came back to Georgia, because he was good friends with the king decided to make him colonel of his very own regiment of about 600 to 700 men called the 42nd Regiment. And this guy right here is dressed as one of those folks would be. So not only does Georgia have a well-armed militia, it actually has an entire British regiment at its command, which comes in handy because this conflict on the border was bound to happen sooner or later. And so what progresses is something called the War of Jenkins Ear. I'm not going to get into the whole history of that very interesting war, which also becomes the larger War of the Austrian Succession. But here in the New World, it's basically the Spanish trying to kick the English out of Georgia and further up the coast, and the English trying to hold on. Oglethorpe tries to take the initiative and gets his guys together, marches south to take out St. Augustine and the Spanish fort there. That expedition does not go very well, and Oglethorpe has to go back to Georgia with tail between his legs. And now the Spanish think they have a chance. So they start pulling in a good amount of troops from their colonies in Cuba, and they march into Georgia, and they land, and their idea is to sort of take St. Simon's Island and march in that way and march up the coast to take Savannah. They can't just go straight into Savannah. They've got to take out the military fortifications, which are Fort Frederica and Fort St. Simons. So they take Fort St. Simons, they march up, and they're about to cross over to Fort Frederica when they receive a little battle and you got to love these names, the Battle of Gully Hole Creek. And this is not a big battle, but it's enough to make the Spanish go, oh, maybe we should fall back and get more reinforcements and get more support. So they start falling back. And what happens is they have to cross a march. So Oglethorpe knows this. He sends his guys to sort of ambush them on this march because, we can go to the next picture and I can show you a marsh is a marsh, right? It's very soggy and there's not always a lot of solid ground to walk on. So the Spanish forces are very narrow. They're only walking one or two wide, all strung out. And so when the English, the Scots, the 42nd, the Georgia, the Savannah militiamen start attacking them, there's nowhere for them to run and nowhere for them to go. They basically have to take off into the swamp and run away. They take such extreme casualties here at the Battle of Bloody Marsh that the entire expedition gets back on its boats and it goes away. And even though they didn't know it at the time, that is the last excursion that Spain ever takes into Georgia, and the colony of Georgia is more or less secure as the focus of the war for both England and Spain moves from the southeast of North America further on into Europe because the stakes are much bigger there, and the war sort of dies down. And as a result, not only is North and South Carolina safe because of Georgia's buffer status, but Georgia itself starts to settle down. As it starts to settle down, Oglethorpe is called back to England. He has to go back because he has mortgaged his entire personal fortune to pay for these military expenditures. He has been accused of financial misdeeds, and he has to go back to England to answer this. He has every intention of coming back, but as it turns out, he will not return. He goes to raise more troops. He goes to clear his name. At that time, the Jacobite Rebellion of 1745 cranks up, and he has to lead forces in that. One thing leads to another. He doesn't do very well in the Jacobite Rebellion, and he is sort of pushed to the side as far as Georgia goes. He continues to be an advocate for Georgia amongst the trustee meetings, but he starts going to the trustee meetings less and less as time goes on. Well, why is that? It's because the Georgians themselves start to fuss about what is supposed to be an ideal colony. They see across the Savannah River in South Carolina these very large plantations with lots of land, with lots of wealth and prosperity. They see people drinking rum, and they want some of that too, because it is human nature, unfortunately, to do as little work as possible and make others do the work for you so that you can get rich. That's not what Georgia's founded on, but that's what they're seeing, as I said, in North Carolina and especially in South Carolina. So a group develops amongst the Georgia settlers called the malcontents. And the malcontents basically start petitioning the trustees and using political influence within Parliament to try to get the rules that the trustees have put in place changed. And the trustees become less and less rigorous on enforcing their ideals, especially that of slavery. And when it comes to slavery, the trustees more or less start to give up. And from this point on, this is when Oglethorpe sort of throws up his hands and gets so frustrated, he stops going to trustee meetings. He's still technically a trustee, but he doesn't. So the malcontents write this, which sounds very flattering. It's dedicated to Oglethorpe, and it's a narrative of the colony of Georgia, but basically what it is it starts laying out how Georgia is a stunted colony, how it's not achieving everything it could achieve because of the interference of the trustees. You know what would make Georgia a great colony? To become a royal colony, like all the other ones up and down the Atlantic seaboard. And so people begin agitating for this. And the big reason they do it is so they can get plantations and especially rice plantations, right? This is the days before cotton. I know we're thinking of plantations and we're thinking of enslaved labor, but this is pre-cotton. This is mostly rice and other types of farming. They're still trying to make the silk work. It still is not working because of the climate. But we've got here, you can see an ad for slaves coming into the New World. This is from Charleston. Charleston's not that far away from Savannah. Lots of people in Georgia had already purchased slaves and were using them illegally. But again, what's the enforcement in the colonies? The trustees are supposed to be in charge. A rice plantation here. Rice is an incredibly valuable product because it's a foodstuff that has a long shelf life and can be transported basically anywhere and will last for a good amount of time. And it's very healthy and sustaining. Perhaps not very tasty, but you get the picture. So the Georgians want this to happen, and they begin agitating for it. They've already got plantations set up. They're already starting to break the rules of limiting land ownership to only 50 acres per member of the household. They're starting to get slaves. They're importing rum, and basically the trustees at this point throw up their hands. And a year before their charter ends, they petition the crown to be released from the charter and to turn the colony over as a royal colony. And that is what they do in 1752. Fortunately, King George II decides that he would love to have this colony. He appoints one governor who doesn't do very well, but then he brings in another fellow named James Wright, who is the governor of the colony of Georgia from very early on, I think 1755, until Georgia gains its independence in the American Revolution. So James Wright is a very central figure in that. But what of poor James Oglethorpe? He sees this happen. He sees the revolution happen. He sees the Georgia that he believed in and fought for sort of go downhill and cease to be. He gets out of politics. He becomes involved in literary circles. He knows Samuel Johnson and things like that. And he lives past the American Revolution. This is a drawing of him. You can see he's kind of a grumpy old man. I'm very admirable at that point. Just sitting around wearing a sword, reading a book. People, that's the dream. If you can, it's good work if you can get it. But Oglethorpe sees the American Revolution. He sees America, including Georgia, win its independence. And at some point, John Adams himself, as representative to the Crown of England as America's first ambassador to Great Britain, does meet with James Oglethorpe. And James Oglethorpe reportedly says to Adams that he wishes the new world and the new nation of America every success. So Oglethorpe had been keeping an eye on things, but unfortunately that's it. So Georgia goes from utopian to royal colony to an independent state. And I think it's important to know just how small when we say Georgia was. We've got a map here. This is the territory in 1773 before the American Revolution, and we've got the modern state outlines so that you can see, here's Georgia. We normally think of Georgia as this big state. It's one of the biggest east of the Mississippi. But when we're talking about colonial Georgia, especially founding Georgia, we're only talking about this. See this little yellow part here? When Oglethorpe established Georgia, that's Georgia. That's it. It has a very low population. It has a very low impact on British trade. We eventually go up into this blue area here and increase some of this down to the Altamaha. But you can see it's a relatively very small colony, even up past American independence. And we are sort of surrounded by lots of native tribes. We've still got the Spanish to the south of us in East and West Florida. And so Georgia, even 20, 30, 40 years on, is still in a very precarious position. But as we know, it hangs on and continues. We're not going to go into the story of Georgia in the American War for Independence. That's a story for another day. But how much of colonial Georgia is left, especially in Savannah? Well, I want to show you this image of Savannah again, how they're laying out the tithings and the squares and the trustee lots and things like that. This is the first image I showed you of Savannah actually being created and built. And when we go to the next slide, we have a modern map of the Savannah Historic District. And I want you to look at this. We live up at the top along the Savannah River. You sort of have the warehouses and things like that. But once you make it up the bluffs, Savannah's layout continued in the way that Oglethorpe intended on and on. It is the most precisely laid out cityscape certainly in the original 13 colonies and probably in America. It has received numerous awards, and Oglethorpe has received many posthumous honorary awards for his work and his surveying and things like that. And you can see when you go to Savannah, you're going to see a lot of the colonial, the very layout of the city is still there. And you can still go to one of the houses. One of the oldest houses in Savannah is the Herb House. And you can see here, supposedly, now it didn't look like this. All houses change over their lifetime, especially the older they are. This house was originally built, we think, at least the foundations were laid, in 1734. So the year after Georgia was founded. And this is a really cool house, and they could be advertising it as one of the oldest structures in all of North America. But what do we get? It's a pirate house. It's a restaurant. It's a tourist trap. You can still go there. You can have incredibly overpriced food here, and it's worth it just to go in the house and see it. It's very cool. I'm sorry, Pirate's House, but I'm not much for gimmicks and things like that when it comes to history. But you can see it. Now, if you want to go see some serious Georgia colonial history, probably the best place to go is to the Colonial Park and Cemetery. This is a cemetery that was in effect established at the very beginning of Georgia. And some of the oldest graves there go back to the late 1730s. And it's basically just name after name of important Georgia founders, important Georgia leaders. Oglethorpe's not here. He's buried in England. But there are a lot of names here from before the American Revolution, during the Revolution, after the Revolution. It is a remarkable place, and that's a great thing about Savannah, the way it's laid out. You can walk everywhere. So that is, again, a nutshell history of the founding of Georgia. There's so much more we could talk about, the different and diverse groups, the trade, the warfare, lots of things in Georgia. And the way Georgia was founded with such high ideals, which we haven't always met, is always inspiring, much as the founding ideals of our nation in parallel. So go read a book, go read a magazine article, and for goodness sake, go visit some of these fantastic sites of colonial Georgia. That's all we have time for. I want to thank all of our members for continuing to support us and making this one of the great things in Northeast Georgia that we're able to do. It's all because of you. And until we see you again here or at the History Center, stay safe and take care.